Today's scripture is Mark 9, 2-13. 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and brought them to the top of a very high mountain where they were alone. He was transformed in front of them, and his clothes were amazingly bright, brighter than if they had been bleached white. Elijah and Moses appeared and were talking with Jesus. Peter reacted to all of this by saying to Jesus, "Rabbi, it's good that we're here. Let's make 3 shrines, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He said this because he didn't know how to respond, and for the 3 of them were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice spoke from the cloud, "This is my son, whom I dearly love. Listen to him." Suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them not to tell anyone what they had seen until after the human one had risen from the dead. So they kept it to themselves, wondering, "What's this rising from the dead?" They asked Jesus, "Why do the legal experts say that Elijah must come first?" He answered, "Elijah does come first to restore all things. Why was it written that the human one would suffer many things and be rejected? In fact, I tell you that Elijah has come, but they did to him whatever they wanted, just as it was written about him."
As I said earlier, it may seem strange, I think, for people to think about Jesus as a contemplative or even a mystic. But I think that's in part because of our thinking about mysticism has been shaped by popular culture, and also just the loss of kind of the everyday mystery that I think we have in our lives, because things are just, quite frankly, just a lot easier for us today than it has been in most of human history. Sometimes people think of mystics as people who believe in a kind of spiritual magic, maybe like, I don't know, Harry Potter or something like that. Other people may think about mystics as people who are too experiential. And I think, broadly speaking, this is generally what people think of when they think of a mystic or someone that is deeply contemplative. They think of it as someone who lives a life that's disconnected, like a cloistered life away from the realities of their community. And to be sure, there are some people who identify as practicing a kind of mysticism that go along that kind of path. But when I speak of Jesus as a Jewish mystic, I am using a broad and traditional definition that you would find in religious studies. Mysticism just refers to someone that has an experiential knowledge of God. A mystic knows God in their being, in their core sense of self. They just know. And so I kind of to expand on that even general definition, I define a mystical experience as a state of consciousness or awareness that is best understood as a deep and abiding sense of union with the sacred, a sense of reconnecting, a sense of seeing, experiencing even something just new. Now, one of the drawbacks of not seeing Jesus as a Jewish mystic is that we fail to see the ways in which he emphasized connection with the Spirit as just a practical reality, something that was a part of what it meant to practice his understanding of religion, just a core aspect of what he understood he was teaching. In these experiences, the boundaries between the sacred and the profane, the boundaries between ourselves and God, these boundaries would soften, and we realize that perhaps we live in a space, in a place where maybe we're not so separate from God after all. This is what we see taking place in this passage that we just read in Mark 9, what's often referred to as the transfiguration of Jesus. Jesus goes up to pray, and he has this encounter. He has this encounter with Moses and Elijah. And he has this encounter in front of James, John, and Peter. And when you look at the different synoptic gospels, they portray it somewhat differently in each one. Sometimes they think they're dreaming. Sometimes they know they're awake. But what I appreciate about Mark is that it's this deep and abiding awareness that, no, I am seeing what I know I am seeing, but I'm also questioning, is this real? Is this true? This is the perspective of the disciples. And so Jesus emerges from this conversation with Moses and Elijah with a kind of renewed understanding, a deeper awareness of his role in his own community, a deeper awareness of the role he will play in the salvation story of his community. He is able to communicate and discuss and talk about the kind of suffering that he knows he will have to endure in order for his people to see him for who he is, in order for him to connect with his people, in order for him to actually help them transform their consciousness, their relationship with God. Moreover, he invites his disciples to reinterpret their religious tradition in the ways in which he has begun to understand himself as playing a key and central part. So when they ask Jesus the question, why do the legal experts say that Elijah must come first? Thinking about the coming of God, God redeeming acts upon this community, what they are asking Jesus, they're asking him, how are you the Messiah when we have been taught that Elijah must come first? And Jesus, and we see this in the Lucan version of the story, Jesus helps them understand that Elijah has come because he understands John the Baptist to have played that role of Elijah, that forerunning prophet. Again, he has this awareness, this sense of knowing. The mysticism of Jesus is marked by an intimacy with God and this kind of knowing. In each of these encounters with the Spirit, he leaves understanding something that he didn't fully understand, or being able to explain something he couldn't quite fully explain before, with this profound awareness of what is actually real. Indeed, mystics, in my experience, have this deep awareness of this reality, this realness. Namely, they know that our relationship with our connection to God is much more immediate than we often believe it to be. And not immediate in the sense of ease, as if we can press some button and have this immediate contact with God. Rather, it's this understanding that God is much more accessible to the human experience than we often think God is, that the kind of mediators that we have, religious institutions or traditions, perhaps they aren't quite as important as we make them out to be. They are the tools. They themselves are not God. You see, in our ordinary and everyday consciousness, we understand, in a sense, ourselves to be in here, right? So we live our life recognizing that we are a person. We have a sense of separateness to the world out there, right? Even the way we speak, our language is subject, object, I and thou. We see ourselves through this distinction, and our personal self is boundaried by that which is other. However, the mystical experience, they have this sense, that separation that we feel, that separation that we know to be true, that boundary we have in ourselves is replaced by a sense of connection, a sense of relationship, a awareness of what actually is. Our boundaried self in these moments becomes porous, and rather than experiencing a kind of separation, we experience a radically new way of being in the world, a radically new way of seeing the world as it always has existed. And we see this in the Bible. We see this in the tradition Jesus would have interpreted when we read that Moses walks around for years, tending his flock, passing by the same places over and over again. And on one chance encounter, Moses turns aside and sees this bush. He sees it burning. The way it's written, we don't know that it just started burning right then. The way the text reads, it could have been burning the whole time. The only thing that changes is Moses' awareness, his conscious awareness to take the time to look and see what is. A few weeks ago, we talked about Elijah and his encounter with God. Elijah, this prophet, had these multiple times in speaking to God and feeling God being spoken to him. And yet, in this moment where he is afraid and he is hiding in the mountain, he's having this conversation with God, saying, God, please help me understand, how am I to connect with my own community? They will not listen to me. And God calls him out of the mountain, and he hears God, not in the loud thunder, not in the earthquake, not in the fire, but in the silence. In that still, small voice, you see these mystics that we have throughout our text. They help us understand that God has always been there. God has always been there. And in those moments of awareness, something melts away. We are able to see what we haven't seen before. Mystics recognize that human beings, rather than religious institutions, mediate our relationship with God. No tradition, and I would argue that no religion has a monopoly on access to the sacred, has a monopoly on what it means to know God. And I believe that Jesus spends much of his ministry trying to teach his disciples the depth of this truth and the importance of these contemplative experiences. To be sure, he doesn't believe these experiences are just limited to himself. Rather, in what the Gospels record as his first major public address, the Sermon on the Mount, he teaches his followers that we must remove the things in our lives that block us from having such an intimate relationship with God. In Matthew 5, verses 27 through 30, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said, 'Don't commit adultery.' But I say to you that every man who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery in his heart. And if your right eye causes you to fall into sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better that you lose a part of your body than your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to fall into sin, chop it off and throw it away. It is better that you lose a part of your body than your whole body go to hell." Often people focus on the first part of this verse, verses 27 through 28, and they get stuck on this part of adultery, and they lose track that verses 29 through 30 have nothing to do with adultery and have everything to do with the things that can block us from being connected to God. Jesus is not telling people to literally remove a limb from their body. Rather, he's telling his listeners that we need to remove the things in our lives that block us from living a life connected to God. We need to remove the things from our lives that block us from living the way that God has called us to live. That it is better to remove those things, even if it is a great cost to us emotionally in that moment, because in the long run, in the rest of our lives, we will feel a connection to something we know to be true. And we will know that it is worth it. In his famous lecture, Mysticism and Social Action, Howard Thurman, he builds on this point that Jesus makes in this passage. Thurman writes that the mystic begins with themselves. It is crucial for them to remove from their own lives that which blocks the awareness of God in themselves. For the mystic, social action is sacramental because it is not an end in itself. Always, always, it is the individual who must be addressed, located, and released underneath their misery and their hunger and their destitution, that whatever may be blocking the way to their own center, where their altar may be found, this must be removed. Whatever may be blocking the way to their own center, where their altar may be found, this must be removed. This is the essence of the mysticism of Jesus. This is the essence of mysticism as it is practiced. It is to blur the lines between ourselves and God, to recognize those lines have always been blurred, that we must remove the things that block us from this awareness. And so the question that Thurman invites us to ask, that Jesus invites us to ask ourselves, is what blocks us from these experiences? What prevents us from experiencing the immediacy of God's presence? This is tricky, and I think it's worth us spending some time discussing and reflecting on. I know for me, as I try not to ask y'all, to expect y'all to do anything I don't do myself. I have read Thurman's Mysticism and Social Action multiple times. I absolutely love this book, and every time I read this quote, I ask myself, what is blocking me? What is preventing me from being in touch with my own center? And sometimes, it's something that's so obvious. It's that for me, it's the busyness of life, just the practical realities of having multiple jobs, of being married and being a father, and focusing so much on those things. And yet recognizing that even in the midst of that busyness, often it's just taking the time to pause, to stop, and to just see. And sometimes it'll be in those moments where I am frustrated about something or I'm thinking about something else, and I stop and I look at Isaiah playing. Or I look at him running up this cliff while we're on vacation. And in that moment, I see the truth. I see what is. I understand the importance of slowing down, of being present, of paying attention to what is real. Or perhaps for some of you, you understand what that is. And I know for myself, the other area, and there are multiple areas. I could honestly preach a whole sermon just on things that are my problem, but that's my therapist's job, not y'all's job to hear that. But it is, in fact, my reliance on my intelligence. I went to school for a long time. I never thought of myself necessarily as a smart person until I was in college and realized that, I'm actually kind of smart. Compared to the other people, right? Compared to the average person. And what I found is that once I kind of embraced this, which is wasn't necessarily easy to do at different times, is that I began to rely too much on my intellect. I began to rely too much on the fact that I was smart and that I could figure my way out of situations. And what I have come to realize, and I've said this in different ways in this space before, is that we sin in our strengths. And I talk about sin as a failure to love, right? And in this sense, what I'm saying is those spaces where we perceive ourselves to be strong are the places we believe we don't need God's grace, precisely because we are strong. And so I would think that I could figure out a problem. I would think that I could solve a relationship issue. I would think that I could do something where, in fact, what I needed to do was slow down and be present and pray and ask for some guidance because I could not figure it out. I needed to be humble. And that's not always easy. That's not always easy. So I wanted to just demonstrate this. I didn't want to ask y'all to do something that I wasn't willing to do also in front of y'all. And I understand that this is not an easy question to answer in your group. So as best as you can, as best as you feel comfortable, let's spend a few minutes in conversation thinking about perhaps some of the stuff that prevents us or blocks us from having these kinds of experiences, this immediacy, this intimacy with God, before we move on with worship. So this is the time of our service where we invite you to be in an attitude of prayer. We have different prayer stations around this space for you to utilize as you see fit and are able. We have a kneeler over in the corner of the progress flag for you to kneel and pray as you're able, or perhaps light a candle as a means of intentional prayer, or to write down whatever it is on your heart that you want to share. Feel free to write that down and place it under our prayer wall as well. Use the space as you see fit.
Let's all bow our heads together and take a moment for prayer. Merciful God, our faith calls us to live with both mercy and righteousness. And yet, somewhere along the way, however, we have forgotten that truth. somewhere along the way, we began arguing about who deserves mercy and whether or not they have acted with good enough righteousness to receive it and to deserve it. God, we are grateful that you do not act this way. No matter what mistakes we have made or wrong turns we have taken, you always meet us with mercy, and you always invite us to try again. And so we ask that when we fail to be righteous, you show us mercy. And when we fail to be merciful, please show us what is right. Bring us closer to you. Blur the lines that separate our consciousness from the truth of your existence, so that we may live with the awareness that it is within you that we live, it is within you that we move, it is within you that we have our being.
Luke 4:14-21. Jesus returned in the power of the Spirit to Galilee, and news about him spread throughout the whole countryside. He taught in their synagogues and was praised by everyone. Jesus went to Nazareth, where he had been raised. On the Sabbath, he went to the synagogue as he normally did and stood up to read. The synagogue assistant gave him the scroll from the prophet Isaiah. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the prisoners, and recovery of sight to the blind, to liberate the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." He rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the synagogue assistant, and sat down. Every eye in the synagogue was fixed on him. He began to explain to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled, just as you heard it."
What I wanted to suggest by having the two passages I picked today, particularly the second passage we just read in Luke, is that what we see is that the kind of mysticism that Jesus practiced, what I often refer to as the spiritual path of radical compassion, that this mysticism, by its very nature, leads to action. And so this is the distinction that I want to draw between what we commonly think of mysticism or contemplation and what I believe Jesus shows us in his life and in his ministerial vision. Mystical experiences not only change the way people see the world, it empowers us because we've experienced a reality, a new reality, a ground of being greater than ourselves, and the world as we previously knew it to be has fundamentally changed. And because we are empowered by this knowledge, we can develop a particular kind of courage that can lead us to protest against the way things are, because we understand, we know the way things ought be. And that distinction, that dissonance between understanding the way things are and fundamentally in your bones knowing the way things ought be, it drives you to go into the world. It drives you to do something. You are unable to just sit with it and sit idly by. It is, as Jeremiah says, a fire in your bones, something that you cannot hold in. In this way, compassionate action, social action, is an expression of resistance against whatever it is that separates us from the way the world is to the way it's supposed to be. Mysticism is an expression of resistance against anything that separates us from our experience of God. And because a part of our experience of God is mediated through our relationships with others, mystics are driven to do acts of compassion to mend the wounds that separate ourselves and others from the sacred. And so what we see Jesus describing in this passage is a part of his mission to repair, to heal, to mend the wounds that have separated human beings from God in his own life. He sets out to mend the wound of poverty, as we discussed a few weeks ago, growing up in this imperial domination system, making sure that his people might have access to some of the goods that they actually produce, knowing full well that what they have been able to procure is just the leftovers, just the crumbs of what the empire has not already extracted from them. He talks about liberating those who are incarcerated, those who are imprisoned, those who are perhaps held captive to their passions, held captive to the ways in which they fail to love, or literally those who have been wrongfully incarcerated, wrongfully held captive, liberating those folk from what is binding them. He sets out to liberate the oppressed, all those who have experienced what it means to live with their backs against the wall. Jesus sees himself as a mystic, as a prophet in the tradition of Isaiah, which is why he is quoting the Isaiah scroll in this passage. And as he's reading the scroll, I imagine that initially, that those people who are in the temple in Nazareth, and to be sure, like, we understand that the practical reality is it probably wasn't in the actual temple per se. It's probably just literally in a courtyard area where they gathered to worship. But those who were gathered around him as he was preaching, I'm sure they were impressed by what Jesus was saying. I'm sure they thought to themselves, yes, I understand what you mean. I have experienced oppression. I too have experienced poverty. I too have experienced unlawful imprisonment. I understand what it means to live with my back against the wall under the yoke of empire, and I long to be free as our ancestor Isaiah told us we would be free. Jesus is preaching a message of liberation for us. Is a message that they needed. It's a message that we all needed, a message they needed in their time and in their context. And while this is true, fundamentally, Jesus was preaching a message of liberation for his own community. This was not all that Jesus was saying in this sermon. After reading that part of the Isaiah scroll, Jesus continues speaking to the people in his hometown, speaking to the people in Nazareth. In verses 23 through 30, he goes on to say, "Then Jesus said to them, 'Undoubtedly you will quote this saying to me, Doctor, heal yourself. Do here in your hometown what we've heard you did in Capernaum.' He said, 'I assure you that no prophet is welcome in the prophet's hometown. And I can assure you that there were many widows in Israel during Elijah's time, when it didn't rain for 3.5 years, and there was a great food shortage in the land. Yet Elijah was sent to none of them, but only to a widow in the city of Zarephath, in the region of Sidon. There were also many persons with skin diseases in Israel during the time of the prophet Elisha, but none of them were cleansed. Instead, Naaman, the Syrian, was cleansed. And when they heard this, everyone in the synagogue was filled with anger. They rose up and ran him out of town. They led him to the crest of a hill on which their town had been built so that they could throw him off the cliff. But he passed through the crowd and went on his way." You see, for Jesus, as he's reading this Isaiah scroll, as he is talking about what his guidelines for a religious community ought be, as he's explaining to them what it means to have this kind of divine encounter, to understand the ways in which God has called us to be in the world, and this distinction from what is to what ought be, Jesus doesn't limit this to his own community. He doesn't limit it to people who look and think and act and worship like him. For Jesus, these compassionate actions, these social actions that arise out of our relationship with God, move us to see humanity in all others, not just the people who are around us, not just the people who believe what we believe, who vote how we vote, who engage in the world in the same ways that we engage in the world. You see, this is the hard part. This is the hard part of the sermon. This is the hard part of what it means to practice this spiritual path, because it is about moral consistency. It is about having values, having virtues, identifying a way of being in the world and applying that consistently across all people you encounter. You see, because you can't argue for humanization of your own life while internally dehumanizing those who have harmed you. You can't argue for people to love you and then fail to love them. You can't argue for your own human rights and yet want to take away the rights of others. We see this being played out in the public square right now with respect to religion, and particularly the kind of Christian nationalism that we see. The argument of rights for me and yet not for thee. To live this way is to fall victim to the myth of redemptive violence. It is to fall victim to the idea that somehow if we do unto others the same violence they have done to us, we will be redeemed. But this is, in fact, a myth. Violence only begets violence. Darkness only begets darkness. There is another way. There must be another way, and this other way is radical humanization. Is to see the other for the person that they are, in their brokenness, and their faults, and in their frailties. And it's to see ourselves as we are, in our brokenness and our faults and in our frailties, and to know that we have much more in common than we often allow ourselves to believe. Again, I wanted to pull a quote from Thurman because I think he makes this idea more explicit in his lecture on mysticism and social action. Thurman writes, "When social action is viewed from this perspective, a very crucial problem arises. The problem that the victims of injustice, for instance, face is not unlike that which faces the perpetrators of the deeds that offend. The assumption here is that both parties, the sufferer and the offender, are cut off from their own altars. I am under obligation to identify with each. It is much easier within the context of mystical piety to identify with the sufferer, the hungry, the poor, the neglected, than with those whose power, privilege, and insensitivity are largely responsible for the social ills. But I must not forget that the ill that a person does to others stands between that person and that person's own altar. Of course, of this they may not be aware. One of the radical functions of social action is to make the offender aware of this." This is the difficult part. We are under obligation to identify with the oppressed and the oppressor, with the victim and those who perpetuate the harm. And this can oftentimes feel wrong. It can be difficult. It doesn't seem as though it is actually necessary, something that I or others ought do. But this is the invitation that Jesus gave his community. This is the invitation that Thurman lays out right here. And it's not until we are able to step into that place and to have compassion for that other, knowing full well that we too have made mistakes that have harmed, that we too have done things that we would otherwise not do. Not until we remove that altar from ourselves are we able to experience the kind of intimacy that Jesus is describing in this passage. We are under obligation to identify with both the oppressed and the oppressor, When I was writing my book, I got a chance to go and visit a bunch of different plantations and read a lot about just the dehumanizing conditions of enslavement and the ways in which people would manipulate and objectify black bodies, and the ways in which the intellect, the wisdom, the genius of people who look like me was taken. The assumption was that they could not be as smart as we thought they are, who they say they are, or who they claim to be because of what they look like. And I would do this, and I would feel a way of identifying with those people who looked like me. I could understand, I could relate, I could connect. I felt in the fiber of my being, I knew what it feels like to be in a place where someone looks at you and they don't think you're capable of doing the thing that you know you can do. And then I did this thing that I'm sure some of y'all probably have done. It's called Ancestry.com. And I realized, because I don't really know my father's family all that well, I realized that all those light-skinned people on my dad's side of the family, they're not just light-skinned because they're not in the sun. I realized that a significant portion of my lineage, that my great-grandfather is in fact white. I realized that my great-grandfather was an overseer, that my great-grandfather worked on a plantation that was about 40 miles from the plantation that my maternal family would have worked on. That they were this close. That indeed I have to identify with the Spanish colonizers, because that is a part of my own history. And I can't tell you, Gabby can tell you, it messed me up. It messed me up. Because everything I had written in that book to this point was from this perspective of the victim. It was from the perspective of the one who had been abused. It was from the perspective of the one who had been taken advantage of. And then I had to recognize and realize that, in fact, when you look at the history of the Spanish, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad when it comes to colonization. It's pretty bad when it comes to racism, that indeed people within my family had been oppressors, had caused harm. And this is the thing that, everything that we hear about happening in schools is what they're trying to prevent people from dealing with, trying to prevent kids from recognizing and wrestling with the reality that some of our ancestors harmed others, enslaved others, abused others. And I had it right here in front of me in a picture and a map of knowing exactly where my family's intertwined. And what it forced me to do, what it made me do, was to revise and rewrite and to rethink every argument I made, recognizing that if I was going to make an argument in a book about environmental justice, about food justice, if I was going to invite people into a different relationship with nature, with God, that it couldn't just be those who were victims, it also must be for those who were causing the harm. That they also had to find a way back to God. That they had to remove the thing that was blocking them from seeing the humanity in themselves and in others in order for people who look like me to be free. The path to freedom for myself, the path to liberation for people who look like me, it requires white people to do work. And I just can't sit idly by and expect y'all to do it by yourselves. For me, a part of what my ministry has been to call, to invite, to help and persuade, to teach, to be in that place, to mediate. because I know what it feels like to be both the oppressed and the oppressor, to be both the victim and those who have perpetrated the harm. And this was not easy. This was extremely difficult. But it was transformative. It has forever changed the ways in which I understand my relationships to humanity. And despite the fact that this is difficult, despite the fact that this is hard, it is necessary. It is what we must do. And this is why I believe we must also remember. We must remember where we have failed to love. This is why we must remember where we have fallen short of our own expectations for ourselves. We must remember the parts of our lives where we believed ourselves to be too strong and not in need of God's mercy, because it is there we will find that we need to remove the boundary between ourselves and God. And it was my own dependence on seeing myself as a victim that had to get broken down for me to be able to connect with a deeper part of my own self. When we can do this, we are able to reach out to the perpetrators of violence and to try and persuade and invite them to remove the altars that are blocking them from experiencing God as well. Not by dehumanizing them, but by confronting them with the reality of their choices. What this looks like will be the subject of my sermon next week. But for now, what I want us to do is to spend a few minutes sitting with what it means for us to identify with both groups. What are the dangers of only identifying with the victims of oppression? What challenges do you face when trying to identify with both the oppressed and the oppressor in a given situation? Now, I can tell you that first question, having worked at a Catholic school, having worked in a place that was predominantly conservative, what my experience was that every person in that space saw themselves as somehow oppressed. Straight, cisgender, white, wealthy men would be like, no, the world is hard for me because I can't, do something that they felt they should be able to do. But this is real. And the consequence of feeling that to be true, despite the fact that we can sit here and intellectually argue how it's not, the consequence of them feeling like that is what has led us to the social moment where we are in. We have to be able to understand where people are coming from. And that means we can't make the same mistake that we see them making. So spend a few minutes in conversation thinking about what it means for us to wrestle with this question, and then we'll move on with worship.
Good morning, good morning. My name is Wesley. My pronouns are he, him, and I have your announcements this morning. It's still morning, great. So good morning. So if you're newer to our community, the easiest ways to get in the know of everything that's happening is to sign up for our newsletter, which comes out on Fridays. You can do that by going to theloftedlay.org/signup, giving us your email address, and then you're on the list. So in terms of what is on that announcement this week in groups, we've got one group meeting, the young adult. They're scheduled for Wednesday. If you're not already on that list, the actual meeting time and information will come out later this week. But let me know if you want to be added to that list so that you have that information in real time as it's made available. Starting next month, which is in a couple days, our book group will be launching on April 14th. If you've already signed up with Dr. Carter, you'll get an email to pick a day and time to meet. So be on the lookout for that email if you're interested in joining this book group. Obviously, there's still time to sign up because it's not April 14th. So let us know if you want to be on that list so we can make sure that you have the meeting times when they're made available. There was a survey this week in your newsletter about our vision and our mission. Please take the 15 minutes to fill it out so we can get some feedback on the direction of the community. But it's in your inbox on the Friday newsletter. If you haven't gotten the Friday newsletter, just let me know, and I'll forward that survey along to you, no problem. And with April around the corner, that means Holy Week and Easter is around the corner. So we've got a full week of programming, Monday, Thursday, sound bath at 8:15 in the sanctuary. And then a Good Friday service here in the loft at 6:30 p.m. And obviously Easter Sunday, in the loft it'll be at 11 a.m. and we'll have the Singers of Soul returning. So it'll be a nice big celebration. Yes, absolutely. And then between the services, there's an Easter tea party from 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. And so we are looking for folks to sign up to help, but also make sure that you come and enjoy the fun of bunnies and snacks and wonderful people. Those are my announcements today. Thank you, everyone.
I definitely want to encourage you all to fill out that survey, and I want to invite you all to give an impromptu, I guess we used to say in my tradition, a hand clap of praise, but to thank Scott for the work he's been doing on putting together, to thank Scott for the work he's been doing, putting together, leading us through this process that I'm really, really excited about, for being able to craft a language to articulate and describe who we are as a community. I know today's sermon was not, was interesting, I'll just say that. I know it's hard to have a conversation about what it means to identify with both the oppressed and the oppressor. And what Jesus actually articulates, and what Thurman articulates in a very similar way in his passages, the way to have this encounter with those who are the oppressors and to awaken them of what's blocking their access to God is to, they use almost this metaphor of like shaking, to literally like, to shake them, to awaken them, to give them some kind of shock treatment. And this is what we're going to talk about next week. I don't want to leave you thinking that it's only about us just trying to identify with it. It does require some particular kinds of action that ultimately moves people, that can move people, that invites them to change the way they engage the world. And we see Jesus model this in his ministry. And so I invite you to receive the benediction. May the grace of God go with you as you leave this place. May you be filled with mercy as we see modeled in the life of Christ, knowing full well the ways in which we both can identify and understand the oppressed and the oppressor. And may the Spirit of God hold you and heal you. And so in those moments where you understand and can relate to and connect with those parts of yourself that you know need to be healed, that you know have prevented you from connecting deeply and intimately with God, may the Spirit be the balm that we need so that we can grow closer to what we know to be true. Let all of God's children say, amen. Amen. Thank you all. I'll see you all next week.